Should supplements like creatine be cycled? Well, let's see. So I want to do a video on the nature of what kinds of supplements and training modalities should potentially be cyclical in nature and what things are sort of sustainable in the long run. I've seen a lot of goofiness on the internet around like cycling certain supplements, cycling certain dietary approaches and things like that. And some of them do have merit, some of them don't. So I want to talk through a little bit about like basic guidelines as far as how to evaluate these things. So often the ones that are cyclical in nature and that we want to use in a cyclical manner are ones that are producing a stress on the human body that is not sustainable, or that the human body will adapt to, and so it no longer causes or produces the kind of positive effect we want, and it can actually eventually produce a negative effect, or just no longer produces much effect at all. You sort of become adapted to it. And so some of these things, like in a classic example would be like strength training, right? You can peak for a powerlifting meet for a short time, but you can't just do heavy singles forever. Otherwise, everybody would have a 1,000-pound squat. So at a certain point, you have to stop. You have to build another foundation. You have to reestablish high volume, then go back into sport-specific training later on when it's time to peak again. So that's just one example of like a training modality. So what's sustainable? I'll talk about training first. So what is sustainable long-term? Some degree of cardio, for sure. Low intensity, steady state, should do it at least a few times a week. Sustainable forever. You can walk, you can hike, you can whatever, you can go on a bike, use a treadmill, whatever works for you. That's sustainable forever. Can you do long distance running forever? Probably not. At a certain age, no. Eventually your skeleton, your knees will say no longer. So what happens if you introduce, here we go, the big term, periodization? Well, if you introduce periodization into the mix, now that's sort of what we're talking about, the strength training, right? This applies to all training modalities. The only things that I'm aware of that you can really do indefinitely are certain types of sports that are lower impact, and I would also say certain types of like training modalities that are lower impact, but you do still have to introduce variations. I don't want to say lower impact, that's a poor term, but less intense. So weights that aren't as heavy. You can't do heavy training year round, but what you can do, honestly, year round, you can train like a bodybuilder. You don't have to take time off that. Now, you should cycle how you approach your periodization as far as like what you're emphasizing, because if you train arms, if you emphasize arms year round, you're going to get to a point where your arms aren't really growing much anymore, and you need to take a break, focus on something else, resensitize your arms to training, that kind of thing. Usually with training and weight training, we think in terms of 12 to 16 week periods, and that's about what it takes for the body to sort of get the best adaptation possible. Whether you're talking about strength or hypertrophy, that's what about how long it takes to get the best adaptation while also not training in a way that's unsustainable. Injury risk is not as high. Whereas if you like try to peak for even a 16-week peak is a long time, by the way. So let's say you did do that though, which is actually kind of what I'm doing right now. My frequency is very low for heavy lifts, right? So that's what I had to do to compensate for that. That said, bodybuilding training though, like high volume training, that sort of stuff, you can train that a year round, but you might want to vary your reps so that you're adapting to different kinds of training modalities and introducing, you do have the concept of novel stress is useful. It's just that muscle confusion is a stupid term because it was this weird thing that went around for a while where people felt like they had to do something different every week. No, but after you do the same kind of curl on the bicep for, let's just say 12 weeks or so, it's probably time to swap it out because it's probably not doing what it was doing before as far as providing an adaptation, whether usually we're talking in terms of muscle growth if it's the bicep. So you just switch to a different one that's going to emphasize more of a stretch, that's going to have the power curve at a different point in the movement, or maybe emphasize holding differently so that there's more forearm involved and it's less isolated toward the bicep. All sorts of ways to slice that. So let's move to the nutrition side. Now that I think we beat the training horse pretty well. On the nutrition side, what do you have to cycle? Well, it depends on the individual, but if we're talking about someone that's healthy, metabolically healthy, they have no type 2 diabetes, they're insulin sensitive, everything seems fine. The only thing that I'm aware of, now I'm assuming here this is someone that's going to maintain weight. They're going to keep their weight the same. They're not going to change. They're going to be just maintaining weight, and they're chasing performance or just general health, right? Not in any particular, they're not trying to put on a bunch of muscle or whatever. This is just your regular individual who wants a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. In that case, the diet's pretty much going to look the same most of the year. However, there is evidence that in northern latitudes, when you're exposed to less sunlight, it can be useful for you to, in the winter time when there's less sun, reduce carbs and introduce a little bit more fat. So the calories stay the same. And when you do this, by the way, your body weight will tend to creep up. It tends to just go back down in the spring when you bring the carbs back in. So in the fall time, somewhere in there, carbs go down, fats come up, right? But calories stay the same. Then you get to springtime, carbs come back up, fats go back down. So you eat a high carb, low fat diet in the summer. That's when your peak carbs are. You eat a higher fat, fairly low carb. You can go pretty darn low if you want in the winter. And the reason this is because insulin sensitivity reduces in the winter when you're exposed to less sunlight. You actually get better at utilizing fats, and you get less good at utilizing carbs for energy. David Herrera's done a bunch of great explanation on this. You can check out his content on Instagram and YouTube as well. In the Becoming Superhuman series, he goes into much more detail, but the long and short of it is that is something that actually has some merit. I don't really do it myself, but that's because I'm usually manipulating weight up and down, and I just use carbs up and down to do that. And by the way, you keep your protein the same, which is generally going to be a gram per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you have 200 grams of protein in a day. The fats and carbs are what can be dynamic, okay? So that could make sense. Now, if you're someone who has metabolic disease, then the cyclical nature of the thing can come into place. How do you sensitize someone to carbs? Well, you want to introduce carbs at times that the body will be most competent at handling carbs and in small doses. So that's going to be post-training first. That's when you're most sensitive. That's when insulin sensitivity is the highest. You introduce some carbs post-training, usually in terms of in the form of fruit. And you also go for a walk immediately after. And then you do pre-training carbs on top of that. And so then you've got carbs on both sides of training. Eventually, this person will be able to probably handle carbs any time of day, particularly in the summertime. That's the really short answer. You might have to introduce certain things like lots more cardio sometimes helps. You also need to examine certain lifestyle factors like sleep. What's the quality of their sleep? Are they having fitful sleep? Are there lights in their room, etc.? EMF disturbances can reduce the quality of the sleep and bring insulin sensitivity down. So do you have a phone that's on and transmitting radio frequency right next to your head at the, on an end table or dresser right next to you, or even in your bed, which is never something you want. If you do that, put it in airplane mode. And the big culprit too, by the way, are wireless chargers. You should never have a wireless charger with your phone on by your head or even in your bedroom at all, in my opinion. So that aside, so yes, cyclical, right? That makes sense. What other things are or aren't? Well, I brought up creatine at the start. Creatine, no, you don't need to cycle that. It does what it does, and it's not a particular stressor on the body. It doesn't meet that criteria where you have to back off like with heavy strength training. It does what it does, and it does it very well. And in fact, it's so subtle in what it does, you just stay on it. You're not going to notice the difference. Like if you notice the difference, it's probably placebo. Like over many, many years, you're talking about, maybe you put on an extra pound or two of muscle. It might have prevented an injury or two, by the way. There are cognitive benefits, of course. It actually prevents Alzheimer's. But like that doesn't happen from like taking it for a couple weeks. That happens really from taking it for years. That's not something that's like a thing that happens because you took an acute dose for a little bit and your Alzheimer's goes away. But it does seem to be neuroprotective against Alzheimer's disease. We don't really know how, but probably by influencing positively insulin sensitivity of the brain. So that does not need to be cycled. And I've heard people talk about cycling it because you lose sensitivity, etc. That's not the case. All that it's doing fundamentally is increasing the water volume of the cells in your body, various cells. So the intracellular water volume goes up. Therefore, they store your cells, especially in the muscle, but there are other ones as well. They store more energy. They hold energy more efficiently. And they're just more capable, which is sort of like the whole key to the fountain of youth anyway, because one of the fundamental differences between children and us as it pertains to aging is that children hold more water. That's why babies look so puffy. That's why they look so chunky and fat, and everything about them looks so different, because they're like all water. And then as you age, you proceed to dry out. And there are only a few ways of getting water into the cells in the body. And there aren't that many, and you should take advantage of all of them, and they shouldn't be cyclical. They should be as much as possible. You've got creatine, and then actually another one is red light therapy, which does not need to be cycled. If you live in a place where the sun is around, you have access to the sun year round because it's not super cloudy in the winter, then do that. Then be in the sun. People use moisturizers on their skin to try to moisturize their skin and things like that. That's fine and good, but you're just adding oil to the skin. You're not changing what's happening at the cellular level, which is where the real dryness and the other problems exist, and where aging, happens. It happens also because of DNA transcription, folding, misfolding and things like that. But this is something you can actually prevent. And so you expose yourself to the light. Now you actually increase your intracellular volume. A good example of this, not that I like his coach because I think he has a bunch of other kooky stuff, but Dana White actually, if you look at pictures of him when he first dieted and lost all of his weight, he actually looks kind of like crap. He looks like an old, wrinkly old man, sort of. He just looks gaunt. His skin hung on him, and he just didn't look good. And he's like, what's going on with this? I don't get it. The change he made was red light therapy. He has a bed that he lies in, and it's a full body red light, just he gets blasted for, I think, 20 minutes or something a day. And that made his face fill out. Everything else probably too. But all he did was increase the intracellular water volume of his face. And you can do that with sunlight. I think that one thing that scared people off of sunlight because they think they're going to look like lizards or something like that, which that's going to happen to you eventually anyways, you age. Use of tanning beds is actually what has sort of brought that look upon a lot of people. Not so much actually being exposed to the sun. And why is that? Well, it's fundamental to how we handle light. That is, the short story is, infrared and red light from the sun increase that intracellular water volume, and UV light burns us. But it also is what causes the change in pigment. Tanning beds just have UV light. They don't have red light and infrared light. So you get the burn without the positive adaptation that helps protect you from the negative effects of the burn. Because one of the things that the infrared and red light do is it increases blood flow at the surface of the skin. That's why you get that reddening when you're under sunlight, but it's not actually a burn and it fades later. That is your body trying to cool that area from the actual burn of the UV light. If you suppress that and you go in a tanning bed and you sit under only UV light, you are actually drying yourself out and you are prematurely aging your skin. Sunlight doesn't have that effect so much, particularly in the morning and evening when red light and infrared is higher and there's very little UV light. In fact, what you would probably notice if you ever tried this experiment is if you expose yourself to the sun in the morning for a while, shirt off or whatever on the beach, and then you expose yourself in the afternoon, let's say the afternoon time is 1 hour, you probably won't burn. You're a lot more likely to burn if you only expose yourself in the afternoon and skip the morning, because you didn't have that nitric oxide and increased blood flow to the skin, which would have helped protect you from burning later. So being exposed in the morning actually helps you deal with and gets you sort of protected and ready to go for what's to come later, which is increased UV light exposure. And then in the evening, as the UV light fades and you still have the red light and infrared, you get that continued blood flow assistance, which will also help with the healing process from whatever damage may or may not have been done with the skin. So long as you didn't burn, you're fine. So anyway, is that something that needs to be cycled? No. If you have access to the sun, that's great. It's not something that you should be thinking in terms of like, oh, this is unsustainable. Like, no, exposure to the sun is plenty sustainable and should be embraced, just like a bunch of other things. We don't need to think in terms of these supplements as sort of cyclical. You don't cycle vitamin C. You don't cycle zinc. Those are sustainable things that are part of our diet and useful and helpful. Creatine doesn't need to be cycled. Training modalities may or may not, but the way that we determine that is based on the impact they have on the body. Is it an overall stress to the body that can't be done long term? It might have a health benefit for acute phases where you sort of sacrifice stress on the body for a greater adaptation over time. But most of the things we do like that, they just don't need to be cycled, and they can be done very sustainably, including creatine.